The morning of May 27, 1945, began in silence. Mist drifted across the airfield at Chiran, blurring the shapes of parked bombers lined in perfect symmetry. The sound of engines broke the stillness. 12 aircraft warming for a mission from which none would return. Among them stood a boy of 17, fastening his gloves with steady hands. Within hours, his name would be remembered as the youngest kamikaze pilot of Japan's war. The sun rose over southern Kyūshū through a haze that glowed pale and metallic above the hills. Along the runway, 12 Mitsubishi Ki-51 Type 99 light bombers waited for clearance. Mechanics moved quickly, checking oil lines, propellers, and the 250-kilogram bombs attached beneath each fuselage. The smell of fuel mixed with wet earth hung in the air. A Shinto priest in white robes performed the purification ritual, the metallic chime of a bell cutting through the hum of engines. The pilots of the 72nd Shinbu Squadron stood in formation, faces young and expressionless, each wearing a white hachimaki headband marked with the red sun of the empire. They had been trained for one mission only, to fly south toward the American fleet off Okinawa and crash into its ships. No return route was planned. Among them stood Sergeant Major Yukio Araki, 17 years old, recently graduated from the Army Youth Pilot School. He was calm, obedient, and impossibly young. The photograph taken that morning captured him standing beside his Ki-51, faint smile, wind lifting his scarf. It would later become one of the most enduring images of the Kamikaze program, a boy about to die for a nation already defeated. By late May 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing. Its navy had been annihilated, its airfields cratered, its cities destroyed by nightly firebombing. Yet the military leadership clung to a single doctrine: to die in defense of the emperor was not loss, but duty. When American forces invaded Okinawa in April, that belief became weaponized. Every available aircraft was converted for TACO, special attack. The Army and Navy divided the remaining airframes into suicide units: Oka rocket gliders, Zero fighters, and, for the Army, Ki-51 light bombers like those at Chiran. Chiran was one of several bases on Kyūshū devoted entirely to such missions. Between March and June 1945, nearly 400 pilots launched from its runway toward Okinawa. None returned. Each departure followed the same choreography. Final rites, the offering of sake, farewell letters placed on wooden trays, a bow toward the east, and the roar of engines rolling into dawn. School children and villagers gathered beyond the fence to wave flags. Some smiled, most wept. Araki's life before that morning had been unremarkable. Born in Gunma Prefecture in March 1928, he joined the Army Youth Pilot School at 15. Like thousands of others, he grew up under the state's wartime education system, one that taught that the emperor was divine and death for him the highest honor. Training was brief. By the time he reached Chiran in May 1945, the empire's defeat was already assured. But the machinery of indoctrination continued. He wrote letters home thanking his parents and promising to die smiling for Japan. The handwriting was neat, the ink uneven. The strategic situation around Okinawa was catastrophic. The American 10th Army had secured beachheads and was advancing through the island's southern ridges. Japanese resistance was collapsing, but Imperial Command refused surrender. Instead, they sought to delay invasion through attrition. The kamikaze became a psychological weapon, an attempt to inflict maximum fear and damage at any cost. The 72nd Shinbu Squadron's mission on May 27 targeted the radar picket destroyers that formed the outer ring of defense around the American fleet. Those destroyers were small, fast, and essential. Without them, the fleet would be blind to incoming raids. At 0600 hours, the ritual began. The priest's chant echoed against the hangars, followed by the sharp ring of the shrine bell. Officers saluted as the pilots walked toward their aircraft, heads bowed. Mechanics fastened harnesses and handed them their short ceremonial daggers. The ground crew tied their white scarves tightly at the neck. Each man was given a cup of sake. No one spoke. When the red signal flag rose, engines ignited in sequence. The combined sound rolled like thunder across the valley. The first bomber began to move, gathering speed down the runway. One by one, the aircraft lifted into the pale light, exhaust trails bending south toward the horizon. The crowd beyond the fence waved until the last shape vanished into the clouds. The final plane to depart was Yukio Araki's. The wheels left the ground, and the bell at the shrine rang once more. Far to the south, the sea waited, a mirror of blue steel stretching 500 kilometers toward Okinawa. Beyond that horizon, the American destroyer USS Braine, DD-630, was on station as radar picket ship number 5. Her crew had been awake for days, scanning radar screens for incoming raids from Kyūshū. On that morning, faint blips began to appear, small, low-altitude contacts moving in formation from the north. The men at the guns tightened their grips. They knew what was coming. Between those 2 points on the map, Chiran and Okinawa, lay the last intersection of youth and machinery, faith and fire, belief and annihilation. The planes kept flying south, their formation thinning as they climbed above the clouds. Below them, the empire receded into haze. Ahead, only open water and the final task for which they had been trained. The formation climbed into clear air above the coast, engines beating a slow rhythm against the wind. Beneath the aircraft stretched the open Pacific, flat and metallic, broken only by thin lines of cloud and the faint shimmer of waves. The distance from Chiran to Okinawa was roughly 500 kilometers. At the Ki-51's cruising speed of 190 miles per hour, the flight would take 2.5 hours. Each bomber carried just enough fuel for the journey in one direction. The bomb slung beneath the fuselage weighed a quarter of the plane's total mass. Its fuse would trigger on contact, turning the aircraft itself into a weapon. There was no radio communication, no formation leader issuing commands, only visual reference, each pilot keeping the silhouette of the next plane steady against the horizon. They flew low to avoid early detection, skimming over the sea where wind gusts jarred the wings and spray flashed against the glass of the cockpit canopies. The sun climbed higher, reflecting from the water in bright sheets of light that forced the pilots to squint through the glare. Below them, the Ryukyu Islands appeared one by one, dark green arcs against the blue. At the same hour, far to the south, the American radar network around Okinawa was fully active. The fleet consisted of nearly 150 ships spread in concentric rings. Carriers at the center, battleships and cruisers farther out, and destroyers forming the radar picket line, the first to meet any attack from Kyūshū. The USS Braine held position about 40 miles southwest of the main invasion anchorage at Higuchi. Commissioned in 1943, the Braine was a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing 2,000 tons, equipped with 5-inch guns, 40mm Bofors, and radar systems capable of detecting low-flying aircraft at 20 miles. Her crew had already endured weeks of constant alerts. Since April, the picket ships had borne the brunt of the Kamikaze campaign. Nearly every day, groups of 2, 6, or 12 planes approached from the north, diving into ships that never had time to maneuver clear. Some were destroyed mid-air by anti-aircraft fire. Others struck with such force that they tore through steel decks before their bombs exploded. The sailors called them one-way suns, small flashes of light that fell out of the sky. Shortly after 0730 hours, The Braine's radar picked up a group of incoming contacts bearing 350 degrees at a distance of 30 miles. The operator reported speed and altitude consistent with single-engine aircraft. The ship's captain ordered general quarters. Klaxons wailed through the decks. Crews rushed to stations, hatches slammed, and ammunition hoists clattered as gunners loaded belts of 40mm shells. The sea was calm, the visibility excellent, conditions ideal for defense but also ideal for attack. Above the ocean, the 72nd Shinbu Squadron maintained its course. American interceptors from Okinawa, Marine F-4U Corsairs and Army P-47 Thunderbolts were scrambled to intercept. The first engagement occurred north of the Kerama Islands. Several Ki-51s were shot down almost immediately. Their engines burst into flame, and the aircraft plunged straight into the sea. Others continued forward, hugging the waves. Witnesses later described them appearing out of the glare barely 100 feet above the water, so low that their propeller wash rippled the surface. At 0738, the radar aboard the Braine registered 2 aircraft closing fast at low altitude. The destroyer opened fire with its forward guns. Tracers lanced across the sky, shells bursting in fountains of water around the approaching planes. One bomber caught fire, banked sharply, and struck the sea a few hundred yards off the port bow. The second kept coming. Its approach was erratic but deliberate, wobbling in turbulence, the glint of the bomb clearly visible beneath its fuselage. Gunners on the bridge deck fired continuously. At 0740, the aircraft impacted the Braine at the starboard side, slightly aft of midships, just above the waterline. The explosion ripped through the hull, rupturing fuel lines and igniting ammunition stored in the engine room. Less than 10 seconds later, a second plane hit the superstructure near the forward stack, detonating its bomb directly over the ship's center section. The twin explosions engulfed the destroyer in flame. Bulkheads collapsed, the bridge lost power, and fire spread along the main deck. The concussion hurled sailors overboard. Witnesses on nearby picket ships saw a column of black smoke rising hundreds of feet into the air. Inside the Braine, temperatures soared as the ship's magazines burned. Crewmen crawled through smoke-filled corridors carrying hoses, dragging the wounded clear of collapsing compartments. Ammunition cooked off in bursts that punctuated the roar of the fire. The explosion that tore through the USS Braine on May 27, 1945, was one of the last successful kamikaze strikes of the Pacific War. The destroyer, burning from bow to stern, became a drifting silhouette amid smoke and fire. When the flames finally subsided, she remained afloat, listing, scarred, and barely alive, but still moving undertow toward the anchorage at Kerama. Her decks were blackened, her guns twisted, and the superstructure sagged under the heat's deformation. The sea around her was littered with wreckage and oil. Sailors moved silently among the debris, collecting bodies and fragments of uniforms, stacking the dead beneath torn canvas. On the Japanese side, none of the 12 aircraft from the 72nd Shinbu Squadron returned. Their disappearance was confirmed by radar silence and the absence of any landing reports. Only scattered wreckage was found in the sea southwest of Okinawa. Military records preserved by the Imperial Army list the date, time, and target. May 27, 1945, Special Attack, Braine, DD 630. The notation beside Yukio Araki's name reads simply, "Died in battle south of Okinawa. His plane hit target." In the hours following the strike, the Japanese radio monitoring units on Kyūshū intercepted Allied transmissions, reporting multiple hits on a destroyer. At Chiran, officers confirmed the success and notified the families of the fallen pilots. Their names were added to the base's memorial ledger, each marked with the character EI, heroic spirit. The mission was considered effective, though by this stage of the war such successes could not alter the outcome. By the end of May, the Battle of Okinawa was almost over. The last organized Japanese resistance on the island collapsed within weeks. American casualties exceeded 75,000. Japanese dead numbered more than 100,000, including tens of thousands of civilians. The Kamikaze campaign, which had intensified from April through June, inflicted severe damage on the U.S. fleet, over 30 ships sunk and nearly 400 damaged, but it did not stop the invasion. The cost to Japan was irreversible. Thousands of aircraft, fuel reserves, and trained men had been expended in exchange for moments of fire and smoke that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. At Chiran, the departures continued into June. Each morning the ritual repeated. Headbands tied, photographs taken, engines ignited. Within weeks the base itself was reduced to silence, its runways cracked, its hangars empty. The war would end less than 3 months later with Japan's unconditional surrender. For the 72nd Shinbu Squadron, the mission of May 27th stood as its final recorded operation. The youngest among them, Sergeant Major Yukio Araki, remained remembered in post-war archives not for triumph, but for the symbolic weight of youth consumed by ideology. The remnants of the Chiran base eventually became the Chiran Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots, opened in 1975. Its collection included aircraft fragments recovered from the sea, pilot diaries, farewell letters, and photographs. In one display case lay a small wooden toy airplane, said to have belonged to Araki, returned by his family after the war. Visitors walked past rows of glass cabinets filled with hundreds of faces. Each photo was accompanied by age, rank, and date of death. The youngest stood out, Sergeant Major Yukio Araki, age 17, died May 27, 1945, south of Okinawa. The museum's curators avoided glorification. The exhibits were presented with quiet neutrality, documents of fact rather than celebration. Every spring, school groups visited the memorial garden outside, where 439 stone monuments bore the names of all Army kamikaze pilots who took off from Chiran. Each monument represented a plane, a life, a single act of obedience that could never be undone. The memory of Araki's mission persisted not because of its military result, but because of what it symbolized: the complete exhaustion of a nation's youth in pursuit of a war already lost. Scholars later described the Kamikaze campaign as a paradox, tactically ineffective yet emotionally defining. For many Japanese, the pilots became symbols of misplaced devotion, victims rather than heroes. For others, they remained evidence of a purity of sacrifice that the modern world could no longer comprehend. The debate continued for decades, echoing through literature, film, and education. In every interpretation, however, the image of the 17-year-old pilot from Gunma stood as the most haunting.